Hi guys, it's Mark Siegfried, Mr. Sci-Fi. Also Mark Siegfried of Space Command, many another thing. We're selling shares in Space Command and the Showrunners Network. Email me at marksiegfried@gmail.com if you'd like to have profits from these projects I'm doing. But that is not what I'm primarily here to talk about. I'm here to talk about one of the most unforgettable people I've ever known, and the fruition of a dream that has gone on for over 50 years, and what a mixed bag that is, or at least it's a little bit sad, and we'll get into all of that. Now, interestingly enough, if someone were asked, given my career in TV, books, all that stuff, to name which writer has had the single most important impact on my life, some people might guess Ray Bradbury, some people might guess Rod Serling. There's certainly something to be said for that, but the real answer is Harlan Ellison. When I was a kid, 10 in fact, I saw City on the Edge of Forever, which was an astonishing episode of Star Trek that just really blew my mind and started me on the road that has led to me being a showrunner and having my own studio. And I became aware of Harlan's work because I noticed that Harlan was writing for Star Trek and Outer Limits, two of my favorite shows. He wrote Soldier and Demon with a Glass Hand for that series. Again, great episodes. And I started becoming aware of him and started seeing his books in used bookshops, and I started buying his books and reading them. And he was a very unusual man. I always used to joke he was temperamental. I always used to joke that Harlan burnt his bridges while he was on them, which was true. But there was a sweet side to him and a bitter, sad, angry side to him. And, you could be hit by the sting in his tail, or you could be, lifted up on his shoulders. And, and it just depended on the bounce. So, but all in all, I knew Harlan for over 40 years. And many of you have heard this story. When I was 15, my mom got a radio, and it was the first FM radio we'd ever had. And I was twirling the dial one night, and I heard something I'd never heard before, which was science fiction writers talking about their writing. Now, I've grown up reading all these wonderful science fiction writers, but I had never heard any of them basically talking. I'd never, maybe Ray Bradbury might appear on some TV show or something, but this was all of them, being interviewed. And that was a show called Hour 25 on KPFK, and Harlan Ellison was a frequent guest. And Harlan on that show talked about the Clarion Writers Workshop. And when I was 19, I went to that workshop. Now, Harlan wasn't teaching that year, but I'd seen him at various signings around town. He would write an entire story in a bookshop window, and then put the pages up on the wall. And he was very colorful, very flashy, handsome. At that point, he was thin and good looking, and always, rather short. I think he was 5'3" or something, but just an amazing, charismatic presence. And by the time I was a teenager, I was going to conventions, and I was meeting Harlan and George Clayton Johnson and Ted Sturgeon, and on and on and on and on. And then I went to Clarion when I was 19 and sold my first short story to Damon Knight, who had been the author of the short story To Serve Man, which was made into the very famous Twilight Zone episode. And in fact, there's the Canomit figure and Rod Serling behind me. And so Damon bought my first short story, and that convinced me that I could make a living as a writer if someone was going to give me money. And that led me on the journey of the Twilight Zone Companion and many other things that I've done since. So, but as soon as I started going to conventions, getting to know Harlan, I was a huge fan of his work, even as a teenager. And so one of the things I did for him, because I was an artist before I was a writer, at least professionally, was I drew this portrait of him. Now you may see that this is the portrait, a photo of the portrait signed by Harlan, and this is the portrait of Harlan. Now, the reason they're slightly different is because I drew one for Harlan, which I gave him, and which is now on his website, and when you went on the landing page, and then I drew a second one for myself because I really liked the portrait. And but that was what Harlan was like at that time. And he was dating a lot of women. He was kind of this odd feminist slash misogynist kind of guy. And then he found the love of his life, and it was a woman named Susan, and she was smart and loving and funny and warm and sassy and wouldn't take any bullshit from him. And it was just great. And this, in later years, is a photo of Harlan as an old guy and Susan. And when I saw this photo at a convention, I hunted down the photographer and I bought this photo because I loved this photo. Because if there was ever a photo that encapsulated love and really represented these two people, it was this one. So, and those are on my wall of my home now. So now Harlan, there was a period, particularly in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, where he was just like a blazing star in the sky, very influential. And there was something called the New Wave in science fiction. There, through the 40s and 50s into the 60s, you had sort of a very optimistic view in science fiction, a certain way that science fiction read. The characters weren't particularly strong usually, but the feeling of we're going to land on the moon, we're going to colonize the outer planets, we're going to jump to the stars. There was an optimism to all of that, despite the dystopic elements in science fiction as well. I once was talking to Ray Bradbury about Fahrenheit 451, which is, of course, this book, and he said it's not a pessimistic book, it's an optimistic book, because ultimately books win, and Montag survives and finds his people. But the New Wave came up, and it was a number of young, brash writers who wanted to write about all the things that science fiction hadn't been allowed to write about prior to that. Things like sex and sociopathic characters and all sorts of stuff. Alfred Bester was sort of one of the earliest of those kind of writers with Tiger, which was The Star's My Destination here in the States, and that had sort of a very sociopathic kind of character in its main character, Gully Foyle. But Harlan was very impressed and loved Alfred Bester's work. But Harlan was really at the front of this new wave and writing very raw and very hard-edged and very kind of dark stories generally. And so then he edited probably the defining anthology of the New Wave, and this came out in 1967, and it was called Dangerous Visions, and this is signed, of course, and his idea was to get writers to write stories that they never would have dared to write before this, and it was just a roster of some of the great science fiction writers: Robert Silverberg, Robert Bloch, Harlan, Philip K. Dick, Larry Niven, and on and on. I mean, there was, I think, 32 stories in here. Fritz Leiber, Poul Anderson, Carol Emshwiller, Damon Knight, Ted Sturgeon, Henry Slesar, R.A. Lafferty, J.G. Ballard, Keith Laumer, Norman Spinrad, Roger Zelazny, Samuel R. Delaney. I mean, this is really a who's who. And this basically was Harlan throwing the gauntlet down. It was illustrated by Leo and Diane Dillon, the wonderful, wonderful husband and wife team that did many of Harlan's book covers. And it came out in 1967, and it just took the world by storm. It was a huge hit. Everyone was talking about it, and Harlan said, well, he was going to do a sequel. So then, and also Harlan wrote extensive introductions to each story, biographical, autobiographical, about the writers, about his relationship with the writers. It was a Herculean task in itself. So then, again, Dangerous Visions came out in 1972. Not that terrible a wait. It was 5 years, and it was every bit as good. It was this is again Dangerous Visions, and it had interior illustrations by the great Ed Emshwiller, a great science fiction artist, one of my favorites. I love Leo and Diane Dillon as well. And this was Harlan's sequel, and again it had Ursula K. Now, one of Harlan's rules was that no writer would be in any of the Dangerous Visions collections twice. So this had Ursula K. Le Guin, Gene Wolfe, Ray Nelson, Chad Oliver, Ray Bradbury, Kate Wilhelm, Joanna Russ, Kurt Vonnegut, Cam O'Donnell, David Gerald, Pierce Anthony, Gan Wilson, Gregory Benford, Ben Bova, James Blish, Thomas Dish, Richard Lupoff, Robin Scott, Terry Carr, James Tiptree Jr. So again, phenomenal writers, phenomenal stories, and as you can see, it was also a doorstop-sized book, and again, signed by Harlan. And this is sort of what Harlan looked like back then in the early 70s, very kind of dashing and with a lot of sort of arrogant kind of quality, but still, this is before he married Susan, of course. So, okay, so then Harlan was promising the last dangerous visions, and he started buying up stories. And a year went by, then 5 years, then 10 years, then 20 years, then 30 years, then 40 years. Now it's been 50 years. And it became this huge controversy because everyone was waiting for the book, and Harlan had bought over 100 stories. Many of the authors, after a number of years, requested them back because they wanted to sell them again. They wanted them out in the public. They wanted people to read these stories, and Harlan, was sad to release them, but he did so. But the question always, and Christopher Priest was very pissed off by all of this and wrote this long booklet about, why Harlan had fucked everyone over and what the problem was and all this stuff. It was very angry, and I actually have a copy of that somewhere in here. But it was really never answered. Harlan got more and more irascible when asked about it as the years piled up, and he didn't want to talk about it. But, we never knew why. We never knew what the story was. So finally, here it is. It has come out. The Last Dangerous Visions. And let me tell you about this book, because this was completed by J. Michael Straczynski, Joe Straczynski, who I know well, and who I was a writer in animation with, and who I insisted be hired to story edit Captain Power when I developed that show, and that led directly to Babylon 5, which I wrote for, and, amazing stuff. But Joe, like me, the writer who most influenced him and most convinced him that there was a path for him to become a writer was Harlan. And but he became a much closer friend of Harlan's than I did. My experience with Harlan was very hit and miss. He he would be. Sometimes he'd be very supportive, very, very warm. For instance, when I wrote World Enough in Time with Michael Reeves, Harlan was very embittered against Star Trek, but I called him up. No, I think it was Far Beyond the Stars, I think. It was Far Beyond, when I came up with Far Beyond the Stars for Deep Space Nine. It was set in the 50s, era of the science fiction writers writing for the pulp magazines like Galaxy and Astounding. So I called Harlan. I asked him a whole bunch of questions for background, and it was enormously useful. And he was very gracious because he knew it was Star Trek. He knew, that I was writing for the enemy, but he liked me and he was kind to me. And interestingly enough, the last thing Harlan ever said to me was, after Ray Bradbury died in 2012, Harlan Ellison and the great George Clayton Johnson of Twilight Zone and Logan's Run and Star Trek fame, they gave a talk at the Ray Bradbury Library in Cheviot Hills, reminiscing about Ray. And I got up at one point and just talked about Ray because he was a very dear friend, and I really was, enormously moved by knowing him and being mentored by him. And the last thing Harlan said, I got a picture with me and George Clayton Johnson and Harlan, and they're both gone now, as is Ray, of course. And the last thing Harlan said as I was leaving was, "It's good to see you, Mark." And that's nice. I'm really glad that was the final moment that he and I had. And sadly, when Harlan died a few years ago, in his early 80s, his wife Susan, who was only in her early 60s, not long after she died in her sleep, apparently of heart failure, and it was really a shock, because the last thing she said to me was, "Don't be a stranger," and I was going to go and visit her and take her out to a meal, and c'est la vie. But Harlan had her. They were together for decades, and she really was the perfect person for him. So, The Last Dangerous Vision. So the good thing about this is Joe Straczynski, many of you know Joe Straczynski created Babylon 5, and he's written a number of movies and comic books and so forth. And again, like Harlan, he has his hard edges and a difficult guy in many ways, but he's done right by Harlan with this book. And he's also now the trustee of the estate and renovating Harlan's very singular house, so it'll be a museum and a research center and so forth. So that's all to the good. That's what should have been done with Ray Bradbury's house, but instead they tore it down. And I have a piece. This is actually a piece of Ray Bradbury's house that was given to me. Ray had a wonderful yellow house in Cheviot Hills, and that's all that's left of Ray's house. but Harlan's house is still extant thanks to Joe, and good for Joe. So, but Joe writes a very, very long opening and afterward as well to this book, and he assembled the final version of the book, and good for him. And he reveals what happened, and because Harlan is gone, and he feels he can share the truth and the secrets. Now, and it's a fascinating story, and I urge you all, if you haven't gotten these 3 books, get them. They're cornerstones of science fiction, and The Last Dangerous Visions sort of solves a mystery the science fiction fans have been wondering about for 50 years. So here's the story in short. Harlan, over a number of years, bought over 100 stories for Dangerous Visions and The Last Dangerous Visions. And in fact, he typed up a list. It was going to be 3 volumes, and he typed up a list. And when was this? Is there a date on it? Probably sometime in the 70s. 79. It was going to be 100. He'd bought 100. It featured 108 writers and 120 stories, and it's just the amazing list of writers. It's Daniel Keyes, Cordwainer Smith, The Firesign Theater, Russell Bates, Vonda McIntyre, Frank Herbert. These are just some of the names. There's others as well. Michael Moorcock, Wallace West, William Kotzwinkel, Octavia Butler, Tom Reamy, Alfred Bester, Robert Thurston, Ed Bryant, John Varley, Joe Haldeman, Dan Simmons, George Alec Effinger, A.E. Van Vogt, Fred Saberhagen, Gordon Dixon, Michael G. Coney, Jack Williamson, Gordon Eklund, Anthony Boucher, David Wise, whom I knew also, Clifford Simak, Jonathan Fast, and his father, Howard Fast, who wrote Spartacus. Let's see some of these. John Christopher, Ron Goulart, Avram Davidson, Thomas Scorsha, John Jakes, Edmund Hamilton and Lee Brackett, Robert Sheckley, Nelson Bond, Orson Scott Card, Stephen Robinette, Charles Platt, Algis Budrys, Edgar Pangborn. These are the great names of science fiction, many of them. James Gunn, Bob Shaw, Bruce Sterling, Mac Reynolds, A. Bertram Chandler, Anne McCaffrey, Lisa Tuttle, Ward Moore, G.C. Edmondson, James Sutherland, Richard Wilson, Manly Wade Wellman, Doris Pishersha, however it's pronounced, Jerry Pournelle, Arthur Byron Cover, Wilson Tucker, Jared Conway, Jack Dan, Michael Bishop, Connie Willis. Just phenomenal list. Okay, so this book does not have those 120 stories. It has some of them. And the reason it doesn't have all of them is because several reasons. As I mentioned, some people asked for those stories back. Some people didn't want to give them back to Last Dangerous Visions, or they had died and their estate wouldn't give them back. Vonda McIntyre very much wanted to have her story in this book, and her estate wouldn't give the rights, which is a shame, because I knew Vonda, and she was a wonderful person and part of the Rubber Ears Club that I ran for a number of years of Star Trek writers. And but I think if one did a kind of conscientious search, you could find many of the stories that aren't in here because they were published elsewhere. So you might be able to assemble sort of like Harlan's version of this. Though, as Joe mentioned, there was never really a final list of those stories. And Harlan just kept buying and buying. Now, but the reason why the book never came out was, and Joe talks about this, because as soon as he came out to L.A., he wanted to meet Harlan, and they became fast friends. It was because, Joe had been a psychology major. That was his degree. And the first time he ever saw Harlan in person, he had the feeling that Harlan was bipolar and, the manic depressive. And because Harlan had this incredible energy, this incredible intensity, and then he would go into depressions. And over the years, as he became more and more a friend of Harlan's, what happened was, as Harlan aged, the manic, euphoric moments became fewer and fewer, and the depression took over, to a point where Harlan even stopped writing for long stretches and was basically just staying in bed. And it was really, really sad and really terrible. Now, Harlan was still presenting a face to the world of an amazing man, a clever man, an involved man. And so I had no hint that this was what was going on in his house. But that was what was going on. He couldn't complete the the collection. And also, another sadness about Harlan's life. I remember when I went to his funeral, to the memorial, there was a quote from Harlan, and it said, "I was important for a time. I was here for a time, and I was important for a time," which is very sad. When Ray Bradbury knew at the end of his life, into his 80s and 90s, the period I knew him well, he knew that he had achieved what he had set out to do. He knew his work would live on, and it has. I mean, Fahrenheit 451 is definitely one of the great novels of the 20th century, and still taught everywhere, thank God. And but see, the thing was, science fiction. You could make a name for yourself in science fiction through short stories, particularly in the 40s, 50s, 60s, even into the 70s, because the pulp magazines, the monthly magazines like Galaxy, Worlds of If, Astounding, Amazing Stories, all the fans could read those, and they could be up on who was writing what. It was a small enough community that you could actually read everyone. And but as science fiction grew more popular and invaded the mainstream because of Star Trek and 2001: A Space Odyssey and the space race and so forth, more and more it was starting to tilt toward the novels. And if you didn't write a big successful novel, you would easily be kind of left in the dust. And Harlan, because of his manic depression, because of his bipolar nature, couldn't write novels. He'd written a few in his early years, but they weren't the strongest. They weren't his best work, and so he had ideas for novels, but never ended up writing them. And so as a result, he still has fans, but it's not that the novel that put him on the map. That didn't happen. And so I think that's why at the end of his life he felt that he had not accomplished what he'd set out to do, what he wanted to do, which is a shame. It's a shame because he really did a lot. And his short stories still are very, very strong, and he won a ton of Hugos and Nebulas. But over the years, as Joe Straczynski became closer and closer to Harlan, he finally started suggesting that Harlan should get help and get a diagnosis and get medication. And Harlan was very resistant, but ultimately he agreed in his later years and started getting a little bit leveled out. But sadly, by then he was in his early 80s, and started having a series of strokes that ultimately left him pretty much bedridden, and he wasn't able to finish this book, much as he might have wanted to. And so Harlan asked Joe to be his executor, and Joe agreed, even though they both knew it was a nightmare, to be an executor on anyone's estate, let alone a huge writer. But also Joe was very determined to get this finished. So what he did, he read all the short stories that were available to be in this that Harlan had acquired, and some of them, since it was 50 years later, some of them were outdated. Some of them Joe personally just didn't like, because Harlan's a different kind of guy than Joe is, and obviously they're going to disagree on what's a good story. Additionally, the times had changed. A lot of writers were trying to be very rebellious and on the edge in the 60s into the early 70s. By the time you got to later decades, it was a more conservative time, and they were less willing to write something that might end their career. But Joe also had the idea of reaching out to some of the newer writers, like the team that has written the Expanse books. And he also let people who've never been published send stories for a brief period of time. And so they're included here. So there are stories here that Harlan did not buy. And there's also drawings, illustrations by Tim Kirk, who's an artist that Harlan loved and that I love too, and who I just met the other day at the book signing that I did. And but he was, many of you might have known his work from the Tolkien calendars back, I guess, in the 70s, 80s. He's not well known now, but really quite wonderful in his way, and so Joe explains what happened and what he's done here to finish it, and I'm very glad he finished it for two reasons. I haven't read the short stories yet, but I have read the introduction and the long chapter where Joe talks about Harlan, and again, because I knew Harlan well, and because I knew Harlan for over 40 years, because he was the writer who most made me a writer, it was really like reading about someone that I was a friend, someone that I knew. And so I'm glad Joe wrote this. Now, these stories in here are by some very well-known writers: Stephen Robinette, Max Brooks of World War Z, Ed Bryant, let's see who else, Some of these writers I don't know. A.E. Van Vogt, of course, one of the very famous writers. Jonathan Fast, Cory Doctorow, Howard Fast. Let's see. Robert Sheckley, David Brin, Dan Simmons, Ward Moore, Adrian Tchaikovsky, P.C. Hodgel, Mildred Downey Broxson, James S.A. Corey. So it's got far fewer stories, but still a doorstop. And it's published by Blackstone Books, which is an offshoot of Blackstone Audio, who has done a number of my books on audio. And it's printed on good paper, and it's not that expensive, and I can recommend it. And you can find Dangerous Visions and Again Dangerous Visions. They're back in print now, and you can also buy used copies, even signed copies, on eBay. And so I can highly recommend all of these. I will be reading these short stories and probably reporting back to you guys. But I thought you'd find that this an interesting tale of science fiction, because the world we live in now is very different from the world that they lived in. I mean, the worst president that Harlan railed against was Nixon, and, you know, that seems almost quaint now, given what's going on, not to get political. But also, it was an era where the genre was coming of age, where it was getting a recognition it had never gotten before. And instead of being ridiculed, all of a sudden you had Ray Bradbury and Arthur C. Clarke and Heinlein and even Harlan on TV being interviewed and treated with respect. And you can find some of those things on YouTube, so I urge you to look those up. Just type in Harlan Ellison's videos will come up. You'll see what a remarkable personality he was. And but more than that, I'm glad that books still exist and that we can visit these places and these times and these worlds and these attitudes. You know, now you can't possibly read all the science fiction that's in print. There's so many magazines on the internet, science fiction magazines, and so many books published, and it's just, you know, dizzying. Whereas back, as I said, back when I was a kid and into the 70s, you could buy and read every science fiction novel. You could read every science fiction story and really get rewarded for the effort. But anyway, I'm very glad I got to know Harlan. It really was so important to my life, and he was an amazing, brilliant man. And whatever demons he had, I'm very glad that he had a wife like Susan and a friend like Joe. And you know, if we're very, very lucky, we find those people in our life who are there through thick and thin, and who see us for our best selves. So that's it for now, and we'll talk again real soon. Thanks, guys.